Hi, everyone. This is Dallas, one of the producers of Ideas of India. This podcast is dedicated to progress in all things. So in the show notes, we've linked to a short survey on how we can improve and would really appreciate your feedback. Thanks in advance, and thank you for listening.
Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and today my guest is journalist Barkha Dutt, who is the author of the new book, To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID. Barkha is an award-winning journalist, the founder and editor of the digital news and content platform Mojo Story, and a columnist with the Washington Post. We talked about her on-the-road coverage of COVID in India, statistical lives versus human lives of COVID, the lockdown and the migrants, the overwhelmingly present and the overwhelmingly absent Indian state, the difference between covering a war and a pandemic, misinformation, and the decline in Indian TV news, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Barkha, welcome to the show.
Hi Shruti, it's so nice to see you and face to face.
I know, this is really exciting for me. I read the book. I was sort of dreading reading the book because I thought I will go through the entire journey again, and it was traumatic enough the first time. Every story clip that I've seen of yours on Mojo, now suddenly I remember, those names and people are coming back. But there was something extraordinary I discovered by the end of it, which is, in my everyday life, I'm an economist. We deal with statistics, aggregate numbers, trends. When someone tells us a story, that's an anecdote, right? That is not what we do. But there is something quite remarkable about stringing these stories together and reading it in this kind of form. So what do you think that our numbers and aggregate data miss that the stories capture?
That's such a great question. And, when you said you were dreading reading the book, as an author, I was dreading writing it because it meant reliving so many painful moments, so much despair, and it was difficult to write. And I was aware when I wrote it that this is not a populist book, right? This is not a book. I have chronicled 2 years of our collective lives at a time when people want to block these 2 years out. And so as an author, that presents all kinds of challenges. However, I remember telling Chiki Sarkar, my editor and publisher, that Chiki, even if nobody reads this book has to be written. And I have to write this book, as painful as it is for me. And the reason is exactly what you said, that we lived COVID in snatches. We lived it from crisis to crisis, from loss to loss, from hope to hope. It was lived day to day, moment to moment, hour to hour. And then we want to pretend it didn't happen. And I think my book comes from the belief that there will be a day when we will need this book. There will be a day when we will be ready as people, as a country, as a society, to step back and remember and look back and then look ahead. And the one thing that united every single person I met over 2 years plus of reporting this pandemic, one thing that united them was not wanting to die or lose someone uncounted, unchronicled, untold. As painful as it was, even if those people today want to block out the memory of what they have suffered, I know that they would want their father, mother, brother, sister, friend, uncle, domestic help, whatever your equation may be with somebody who lost something, that to be acknowledged in some way. And also perspective, narrative. I had none of it in a day-to-day way, as I traveled across India, to step back and see it all come together, to look for the common patterns, to look for things it teaches us about individuals and about us as a nation. I think that's the reason I wrote this.
And, for me, the other interesting thing, when I was reading the book, we have the numbers, right? Even though we don't capture numbers well, we are undercounting deaths, which you've written about. There is underreporting of, even specific things like how many healthcare workers have been assaulted or how many of them died in the front lines. But one really lovely thing that I think the stories capture, which the numbers don't capture, is the why, right? Saying that there was X million people got COVID, or, Y million people died from COVID, doesn't tell us that they died out of helplessness or they died because they were poor and that's when COVID hit them, or they died because they were elderly, who are generally invisible to society, or they died because of the healthcare system. And now when you start putting these dots together, what gets unmasked is that the Indian state is sort of failing us at every level. It's failing us at a policy level, having enough hospitals, even failing us in terms of, making bandobast for enough buses to take migrants back home. So that is something I felt the numbers don't capture, that the stories capture. Is that a good way to think about the narrative other than the collective grief and sorrow we've experienced?
See, I think that numbers have a numbing effect. So it doesn't matter how many zeros you tag on to the lives lost, globally or in India. It doesn't matter, and I don't mean to slight anyone's work here. When I say it doesn't matter, I mean in terms of emotional triggers. Of course, it matters, and it's invaluable research that epidemiologists globally have done on the actual death count. So I just want to clarify that when I say it doesn't matter, what I mean is how people respond. So you can tell people that India's death toll was anywhere between 5 to 10 times higher than the official count. And of course, that's a staggering statistic. And my book has relied heavily on the excellent work done by data scientists in this area. But when I say it doesn't matter, I mean it in framework of the emotional numbness that it induces. So you can keep tagging on the millions, and because we are unable to cope right now with what it makes us feel, we actually look at these numbers and your eyes glaze over emotionally. And therefore, the book is called Humans of COVID, to Hell and Back, because it's not about the numbers. It's about the people. It's not about all the people, but it's about as many people whom I could give a face, a name, and a story to. One good way to think about the nature of the Indian state, I would say, is this: that the state was either too present or too little present. And that was the paradox of its handling. I do want to caveat that by saying that of course, I see states struggle all over the world. Even today, I see the American state in particular struggling with an extremely callous anti-vax movement that is callous vis-a-vis not just its own people, but vis-a-vis the rest of the world, given vaccine inequity. But I think what happened here was this kind of trollish judgment of those who were trying to examine and ask the whys and the hows and the whats. And so that is, a kind of toxic sort of response. If, for example, states were more willing to say, yes, we struggled, yes, we made mistakes, yes, we learned from those mistakes, and I saw the Indian state also learning from some of its mistakes, I think the public would have been receptive. And I think the public in some ways, by the way, is still quite receptive. It sees the world struggle. It doesn't judge the state in the way that we would imagine that people do. So to go back to the nature of the state response, too present or too little present. What do I mean by that? Too present in certainly the first wave, when the national lockdown is imposed. 1.3 billion people are making it the world's largest lockdown, are pushed into a lockdown at 4 hours notice in a televised national address by the Prime Minister. Nobody has an adverse response because by then the world is already using this mechanism. But what happens next is something I discover when I step out of my studio to go to the borders of the capital where I live, and I see men, women and children, their universes bagged into little sacks on top of their head, leaving on foot without food, water or money. And I realize that something colossal is about to unfold. And of course, for the next sort of 3 months almost, following the migrant workers and their exodus becomes my entire life. The mistake we did was to treat the lockdown as a curfew in the beginning. And instead of it being something that was designed to keep people safe and therefore allowing people to participate in it and lead it, we got the police to lead it. And the police, which again in the many paradoxes of India, were also frontline workers, also suffered colossally. But when weaponized against the poor, the brutality of workers already struggling to get past borders of states without anything, just trying to get home like you and I would, and then being beaten up by the police, sent back home. In some cases, there's this image I can never lose from my head of Manoj, a rickshaw driver, sitting outside a major public hospital in Delhi, leaning against a police barricade, having been beaten by the police and then dropped by the police at the gates of a hospital that will no longer take him in because the hospital is COVID only.
And this is Jayaprakash Narayan's Lok Nayak Hospital, the one that's named after him. That the irony of it is just almost,
staggering.
Too cruel.
And why has he been beaten? Because he has no income. He needs to buy vegetables. The vegetable retailer is too expensive. He's trying to walk to the wholesale market so that he can buy vegetables for cheap. This is in violation of the curfew. In Tamil Nadu, we actually had a father and son thrashed to death in a custodial death for allegedly violating the curfew guidelines, as they were called. So that is too much of the state. When you needed the state, there was too little of it, right? When you needed, let's say, bureaucrats at the borders directing migrant workers to night shelters, when you needed people outside the gates of public hospitals instead of people, running from hospital to hospital at a time when there was no public transport, the ambulances had run short.
Opening an ambulance channel, 16 months into the pandemic, we didn't manage to achieve that.
So I took my father, who I lost to COVID, in an ambulance where the oxygen cylinder malfunctioned. It was not an ambulance. Till that time, this is a dimension of the story I hadn't paid attention to. What was the infrastructural availability of the ambulances? But when I had to requisition an ambulance for my own father, and there were no ambulances available, in the sense that I'd have to wait for one, and I panicked and I hired from a private agency, and a ramshackled Maruti van arrived with no paramedics and no infrastructure except for one giant oxygen cylinder, and I had to load my father with his attendant onto like the back seat, which was really like a thin little narrow strip on which we had to place him, and I was in the front seat. And it's a different matter that one of the reasons that I think we lost him is because of that oxygen malfunction between the house to the hospital, which was an hour's journey. But as we were taking him, the traffic snarls. There was no green passage for the ambulances. And I remember taking videos even at that time and tweeting them out furiously to the state government and the central government and saying, we need a green passage for these ambulances, and these police barricades are not helping. And why are they there? Who cares? Why do you need a police enforcement of this right now? And of course, my father's oxygen levels plummeted dangerously and he never made it back alive. And we can talk about that later. But I'm saying I experienced this myself, the absence of a green passage. And to go back to the nature of the state, we really needed the state at times. And the state wasn't there. And we really didn't need the overarching authority of the state at times. And then it was there. And that is the paradox, I think, that was the most problematic during these 2 years.
You talked about the migrant workers. Now, there are a few very interesting things. You are the person who made the migrant workers the story, right? You were the only person who went out there to report when everyone else was sitting in a studio. At one point, there were these jokes on Twitter that all the TV channels send their reporters wherever Barkha is. So, there's like other reporters are literally stalking you, right? Now, when did you know that this is the story to follow? Because you are someone who has access to pretty much anyone you wish to interview. You could have spoken with anyone in the union government, state government, bureaucrats, healthcare professional, experts, which is what everyone else was doing. So when did you know that the migrant worker story is the big story in your mind? And second, in one sense, it became a big story because Barkha Dutt reported the story, right? And then you are the person who made that the face of India's first COVID wave. So how do you think about that?
I think I knew it by the second day after the lockdown. The first day, as I told you, the lockdown is imposed. I, wake up in the morning and I step out. The media is an exempt essential service, so I'm able to use my press card and go out. And I go out and I see, as I said to you, this flood of men, women and children leaving the city. And I see absolutely no attempt in the beginning to stop them. Like I said, there was nobody. I say this in the book that it was the absent state on full display. There was nobody at the borders, none. It's later when this became like a completely unhandleable deluge that you try to use the police. But in the first 72 hours, there's nobody. And I'm not sure what to make of it the first day. So I take pictures, I interview a few people, I put those videos out. I go back the second day. We're now 24 hours have passed. We're in the 36th hour of this. And I see there is just like an unstoppable exodus taking place from the capital. And I start interviewing the people, and they are factory workers, and one of the men, and they walk really fast, by the way. Like I'm struggling to keep pace, so I'm like literally flip-flopping behind them, and they're walking really fast. And I ask them, how many kilometers are you going to walk? And this man says 500, and somebody else said 300, and somebody else said 700, and I am gobsmacked. And then I start interviewing them with their consent. And I always say in Hindi, aap baat kar sakte hain, because consent is something that will come up again and again in this. It comes up later, especially when we're shooting inside hospitals and how we tackle that. So I always say, can we talk? I never put a camera in anyone's face, and they all want to talk. And one very angry man said to me that, is this happening to us because we are poor? Am I walking because I'm poor? Would I be walking if I were a politician's son? And I know in that instant that this humanitarian crisis unfolding before my eyes, and to my shock, I did not see any television channel when I was there.
They were all 2 weeks behind you. Even more, actually. It was strange. I actually, and again, I know some of my colleagues get very upset when I say this, and I will again caveat it by saying, of course, all channels have the individual reporter somewhere who was the exception. Sterling work by small town local reporters, sterling work by photographers in digital platforms, but big media as represented by TV, that was missing. And for, channels were missing. They were doing expert interviews from inside their homes or inside their studios. And till this date, I have no idea why. Like, was it fear of COVID? Was it simply I don't know what it was. I think
laziness.
It's the way
TV.
Also, right? It's not just that they were talking to experts. I remember looking at coverage where they're showing Bollywood actors talk about how they're making rotis and banana bread for the first time. It's a very elite bubble, right? The top 1%, the top 5%. Yeah. And that's where everyone is, because they think work from home means we're all now going to struggle without.
And we're all in the same bubble. And so that's your echo chamber reality. Anyway, I then knew that this was going to be the colossal sort of parallel crisis to COVID. I also knew, talking about the elitism of our audience and of me as well, I represent and come from the same class of privilege, relative privilege, that to get people to care was going to be difficult, because people were already scared. The English-speaking elite was already scared for themselves. Their economic activity, their professional lives had come to a standstill. And honestly, in a situation where it was every woman and man for themselves, how was I going to get my audience to care? And here is where I always say that no amount of preachiness or activism can substitute the power of storytelling. In the end, whether it is making people care about social justice issues or making them care about politics, you need when I say a good story, I don't mean to be reductionist about anyone's tragedy, but you need the craft. You need the craft, or you need the consistency. Mostly you need both to get people to care about things that are not immediately connected to them. How do you get people to care?
Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, he wrote a lovely piece, which is part of his larger body of work, distinguishing a statistical life from a human life, right? And I think what you did is saying that, more workers are crossing state borders than happened during partition, which sounds like, I should sit up and take notice. But it's still different than, Ranveer and Manoj and each person that you're constantly walking with them, you're talking to them, you're talking to their families. You cover the first end of the story, then you actually travel to their hometown, and then you talk to the grief-stricken, right? And I think what you did was, when everything else was about statistical lives, you made the story about human lives.
And that's such an interesting distinction. And I'll tell you that something that really haunted me, and my 100th day on the road in the first wave was in this village. I kept thinking of this image that I had seen in Aurangabad in Maharashtra of a roti, a piece of bread, stale bread lying on the railway tracks. And there were these workers. The trains had just opened after
2.5 months.
Yeah, a really long time, many weeks. But they hadn't opened in some regular way. So you had to still get to some sort of railway station centers to be able to get home. And these men were walking to the closest railway station. It was still a couple of 100 kilometers to walk to get to a point where you could take a train home. They hoped. And they sleep at 4 in the morning on in the shelter of the tracks because they think that commercial passenger trains are not plying, only special trains are, which is true. But a goods train, they don't count for the fact that goods train, they're carrying cargo and so on, supplies are still plying, and a goods train runs them over in their sleep, and what's left of them is, this roti and this one slipper, a little bottle of medicine, and no one cared to tell us who these people were. What were the names of these men who died in their sleep on railway tracks, leaving a little scrap of bread behind? And I said, I have to go to their village, but their village was really far. And it was in an Adivasi district of Madhya Pradesh, and I was somewhere else in the south of India by then. And so I planned it such that on my 100th day on the road, I could be there. But it was so difficult to get there that even when we reached the last motorable point, we had to walk many kilometers in, and then we were in this abjectly poor village. And, I couldn't send the footage back on that day, and I was so upset because we couldn't actually get the report out on that day because there was no signal. And I remember days and days of my days on the road spent under mobile towers, long mobile towers, trying to get signals so I could send footage back. And logistics is half of journalism. It's a very unglamorous thing to say, but logistics from the Kargil war to this date for me has been half of the journalism I've done, which people discount. But sorry, we've gone everywhere. What I wanted to say was that it was about, for me then and in this book, getting my audience to know these people as people. You had to know them to care about them. And so it wasn't going to help me if I was going to do dashboard, expert-driven reportage. I did plenty of that.
Yeah, you did.
I did plenty of that. I'm not discounting the value of that. But that wasn't going to make people care.
And so that's the interesting thing I find about the migrant worker story, because I feel like you made it the story of the day. So when do you know that a story, like just as a journalist, that this deserves 2 days or 3 days and this deserves 100 days of my life? Because there's a huge opportunity cost, right? For every time you're traveling to a very far-flung tribal village, you're not covering 6 ICU hospitals collapsing, some doctor dying, some politician making a faux pas. At one point, you had to abandon and go to Ladakh because there might be a warlike situation at the border. So how do you know that this is what I need to chase and make this the big story of the pandemic?
So there are two ways, right? Sometimes you just instinctively know that this is the big story, and sometimes you know that this is not the big story right now, but it needs to be. I think with the migrant workers, it was the second, that it was not the big story. And I so much felt that it needed to be. And one of the reasons that I felt this was, I think I had a very unique perspective that other journalists perhaps did not have, because they did not, and I'm not trying to pay myself a compliment here, I'm just stating a fact, that I was one person who traveled from the north to the south. So I was actually able to witness the magnitude of what was happening through one person. Whereas the way newsrooms are organized, it's usually multiple inputs coming into a centralized place. So somebody knows what's happening in UP, and somebody knows what's happening in Kerala, and somebody knows what's happening in Bihar. But there isn't one person who knows that it's actually happening in all of these states. And so for me, that scale was very, very staggering because I was living it. And I remember this particular day when the Solicitor General of India went and told the Supreme Court, there are no migrants on the road. And I was on the road and I was seeing these children, men, women. Sometimes at 3 a.m, they would walk because it was too hot to walk in the day. Children crying because they didn't have food. People passing out, like just fainting. And a 9-year-old child saying to me, when I said to him playfully, as he headed home to Uttar Pradesh from his place of work, his family's place of work in Bhiwandi in Maharashtra, I said to him, do you know what COVID is? Do you know what coronavirus is? And he said to me, smiling, yes, it means I don't get food. And so for me, it was like, how can this be not the most important thing that's happening in our country right now? It did not stop me from reporting on other things. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, a lot of times outside hospitals where a lot of the tragedies were unfolding. And I also found that a lot of the I did go inside hospitals where we were permitted, where it was okay to do so, ICUs, children's ICUs, specially able children, what was happening with medicines, what was happening with remdesivir, why was ivermectin being prescribed, why was steroids being prescribed. It's not that I took my eye off the ball on all the sort of medical infrastructure stories, but I just felt that the humanitarian crisis was almost overshadowing what was happening with the pandemic, and consistencies are very important, but sometimes dull part of journalism. We get bored too easily, the audience and the teller of the story. And I just had to sort of hold my nose even on days when I would think sometimes maybe people are really bored now seeing this. And I said to myself, even if people are really bored, they're going to have to, they can turn it away. But, I just have to tell the story. And it's just a kind of stubbornness. I think it's this kind of stubbornness, I was living it. I could see, when I say living it, I mean, I was living it from the north to the south. I was watching this. And I think that unique perspective of being one person who was watching it, I think that made me very, very immersed in it.
I want to tap into this unique perspective of yours because we know on what margins different states differ. Like, the Cliff Notes version of, the southern states are richer, they have better infrastructure, the northern states are poorer, but they're also younger. So we know the numbers, and we know that the migrant crisis was much worse in the northern states because that's where the seasonal migrants are coming from.
The number of workers there are much more, right?
And the younger,
and they're also coming from states that are poorer, less developed.
Exactly. So now in this, you pointed the similarity out, right? So you told us that this is unfolding everywhere over and over again. There is some version of this story. What to you are the most stark differences between the states? Because you covered a lot of them.
So before the state, I'll tell you, what I was fascinated by was how the power of one can make a difference to a crisis. And this, a lot of times, all of our conversations get politicized into left versus right, BJP versus non-BJP. I want to take this conversation above that noise and point out to you that there were individual district magistrates, bureaucrats, who could make or break what was happening in terms of just small things. And I'll tell you, like, whether it was the collector of Nandurbar in Maharashtra, who decided that in time for the second wave, he would commission 2 oxygen plants, or in the first wave, the DM in Dharwad in Karnataka, she was able to stop the exodus in her district. And I asked her how she did it. And she said that there were 2 things. One, I immediately created a place to stay. And so I emptied out all the youth hostels that were under government control. And she said, but it wasn't just about people need a place to stay. They also needed the sense of being treated as people, especially at a time when they were separated from their families. And she got clothes stitched from them by the Khadi Udyog. And immediately as she was placing them in these rooms, she would hand them these sets of clothes. And it was obviously not a survival gesture because there was food and water and accommodation would have been enough. But in her mind, that gesture of dignity, of recognition that these are people, they want to have a bath, they want to wear a clean set of clothes. I don't know. It's that attention to little detail. Surat, fantastic collector, who's when the train started running, was at the railway station from morning to night, sending people off, supervising. So, I just want to say that governance never has local been as important, never has hyper-local been as important, both in journalism and governance. I was able to sort of get to these places, but I was also dependent in little Mufassal towns on what are called stringers in the journalism parlance, which are freelance local input providers who will, who know it. Like, I can't sit in Delhi and know. For example, I didn't even know where the ghats were in the second wave when I went, if migrant workers were my focus in the first wave, the uncounted dead were my focus in the second wave. But I was so heavily dependent on local stringers to show me. I couldn't reach some of these places. They were remote. Some places we could only get to either by walking on backs of motorcycles. So there was a lot of dependence on these local networks. But let's apply that to governance models. Just like I say that the state was too present or too little present, this pandemic tested how our structures of power were organized and arranged. It tested the panchayat system. Yeah. It tested the district civil bureaucracy. It tested the federal structure. And I found that where district governance worked, there was a completely different outcome to what happened. Secondly, yes, there was a greater efficiency in the southern states. And this had nothing to do with BJP and Congress and left. I will pick up two states where I saw this greater efficiency, Karnataka and Kerala. One was a BJP ruled state, one was a left ruled state. But there was a greater efficiency. There was a greater efficiency in use of data, in how centralized the data was, in being able to track movement, in being able to respond to it, right? So, I mean, people like yourselves will be able to tell us why this was, but certainly anecdotally, I observed this on the ground, and obviously where investment had already been made in the public health system. It was a lot easier to respond to the pandemic as opposed to the north where primary healthcare centers were almost never used. They were locked in most places.
They don't have electricity in half the places.
There was no electricity. There was a shortage of doctors. Yeah. There was a shortage of everything at the peaks of the waves, right? Whether it was testing kits and PPE kits in the first wave, and even testing facilities ran short at the peak of the second wave. Oxygen.
Ambulances, beds.
Everything. And in rural India, which was the great invisibilized story of the second wave, the only way you could tell what was happening was to go to these villages and say again you were dependent completely on panchayats. So you would go to the sarpanch and you would say what has happened in your village, and he or she would tell you that strangely in the month of March and April we have seen a spike in deaths, and you would find that in little hamlets 30 people had died of a fever. We don't know if it was COVID, but 30 more people just died. And that is how we were computing what was happening. So we were never this dependent as we were in this pandemic on local systems of governance.
No, I think that's absolutely right. To answer your question, there's, I think three margins on which the difference is, right? One is the southern states are richer. GDP per capita, we've seen over and over globally make such a big difference on the ability for individuals and for the state to handle the pandemic. The second is state capacity, right? The southern states have had more capacity historically, and they've built more capacity. There are some very interesting papers. Some of this goes back to whether they were under the zamindari system or Ryotwari system, whether they were under the British government directly or under one of the local Indian monarchs, right? And that makes a difference to state capacity today because, history casts such a long shadow when it comes to, state capacity building and things like that. But the other thing also, the interesting thing about the local part that you mentioned, state capacity may take a long time to build, but state responsiveness can be injected relatively quickly by individuals who can take massive amount of initiative.
Actually, it reminded you about the imagined, how the bureaucracy had been imagined.
Yeah.
You saw that at play.
Yeah. And, even other like Dharavi, would have been a vastly different disaster had it not been contained so well. Various IAS officers, people in the
and
BMC.
I remember going to Dharavi in the beginning of the first wave and saying, oh my God, 8,000 toilets for 800,000 people. And Dharavi was such an interesting challenge to the fact, and I think the Indian state realized this in the second wave, that this copy and paste template from the rest of the world of stay at home.
Yeah.
What does stay at home mean to people who stay in a room where 8 people live in the same room?
Yeah.
What does it mean, right? 90 million Indian households live in, under 2 rooms.
Yeah.
And I saw this with my own eyes that we were pushing people indoors, which was, okay, maybe we didn't have the science then. We now know it's airborne. Maybe we didn't know. And the world was saying stay at home.
Yeah.
So we were telling people stay at home, and we were using the police to enforce stay at home. And frankly, I don't judge the state on this because we didn't know enough about the science. This was a time when we thought that the virus travels by surface and fomites and people were wearing gloves and they were not wearing masks, and we didn't realize that the outdoors is actually more safe.
Yeah.
Just think of these people who were herded into little spaces, and like I said, not enough bathrooms. Then, of course, everything else that happens, spikes in domestic violence. There was such a ripple effect.
But the responsiveness is really important. I have a good Dharavi story for you. You were one of the Emergent Ventures COVID prize winners, right?
Thank you for that, yes.
So, no, thank you. One of the very early Emergent Ventures grants that Mercatus gave, it is to a company called Infinite Analytics. And it's an AI-based, consumer research company. And Akash Bhatia and Puru Botla, who got the grant, they use large-scale aggregate mobility data to track very, very granular at the block level, anonymized movements. And they locked down Dharavi and they created X number of zones in Dharavi. But they still saw movement within and they said, what's going on? And Akash and Puru were able to show that you need to reconfigure the blocks such that each block has bathrooms. Because people are crossing blocks to buy milk and go to the restroom. And the wonderful thing and why Dharavi got contained is the IS officers and the BMC actually listened to them. They actually saw this analysis and they said, oh, we need to reconfigure. In a matter of days using this research, they reconfigured the blocks. I'm not saying that's the only reason Dharavi's, outbreak got contained, but that is so important, that responsiveness to new information in a world where we're all dealing with just massive uncertainty, right? And we just don't know what the disease is and how it spreads.
That's fascinating. But I know that when I was there, the bathrooms was such a big challenge, right? And that is where I actually say that, even as it like the Mea Culpa moment for me, these are not stories that I ever covered in my life, right? My book opens with the story of the village with the yellow water, and it's 1 hour from Delhi, 1 hour from this capital of India, this emerging superpower that is my country. And we are telling everybody at that time, please wash your hands every 2 hours. And you go to this village where when people wash their hands, their skin breaks into a rash because the water is contaminated from chemical, affluents from the surrounding factories. And they have to buy their drinking water, but even to wash their hands, they are risking skin disease. And you're telling them wash your hands, and the water, I saw it with my own eyes, it was dirty yellow water coming from the supply lines, and I had never thought in my life to report this story. I didn't even know about it, so.
And there are 100 more like it. That's the other thing, right? If this were exceptional, you would have reported this story at some point. I think part of the reason these stories are also invisible is we see horrors like this.
We're numbed, we're also defensive, and rightly so, of the Western gaze, the Oriental gaze, being, portrayed as the country with the poor kids on the street and the garbage piled up and the cows on the street.
Pan stains everywhere.
And we have resisted a stereotypical self-image. And I get that. And I'm as angry and irritated as the next person at the tropes that are reductionist and, do not take the great complexity of my country that I love into account. But we have to be able to be comfortable among ourselves about the multiple realities. And if the Orientalists do not tell the multiple realities of our country, we can't stop telling the multiple realities of
ourselves.
Our country.
Absolutely. No, and this actually, in terms of multiple realities, so there is one thing. So the pandemic, unlike other things you've covered before, has gone on for a really long time. Right now, we have completed more than 2 years. We're in the second anniversary of the lockdown this week, essentially. You've also covered riots. You've also covered wars. You've covered some of the biggest stories of my lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. How was the pandemic different from covering a war? You've written a great book about covering the Kargil war. It came much after your reporting. Almost 15 years after, right? There was a long gap. So it was almost like a retrospective of that. And for the first time in India, we lived through the war as civilians who were not from army and navy families or, any kind of military families. And we felt the loss because you were telling us the story. How are these different? How is a war coverage different from a pandemic coverage?
Let's first talk about how it's similar. If I had to bookend the decades I've spent in journalism, the one bookend would be Kargil and the other bookend would be COVID. And there would be 2 decades in between them, from 1999 to 2020. Is that 2 decades?
Yeah.
My math is poor.
It's 2 decades.
It's 2 decades, right. In those 20 years, some things haven't changed. And here's what's not changed. And I say this now as a journalist. When you report on a crisis, which is far removed from large sections of your audience, and even COVID for the elite was, the second wave changed that. But in the first wave, it was still like if you stayed at home, you felt you were relatively safe. So your audience is not immediately impacted by what you're reporting on. That was true for Kargil and that was true for COVID. Obviously, there are some people in your audience who are impacted, military families in Kargil, and obviously whoever was impacted by COVID, medical health workers and, people who got COVID. But largely your audience is unimpacted. What is the first thing you need to do? You need to treat what you're reporting on, you need to make it about people. For me, Kargil was about the soldiers, the 20-something soldiers, 3 to 4 years younger than myself at that age. I was in my 20s. The men I was meeting, and they were only men then, the men I was meeting were 23, 24. I was under 27, somewhere there. And, they were my age. They were my generation. They were boys who would be men with stories of broken engagements and fears and vulnerabilities. And yes, there was, the multi-barreled rocket launchers and the Bofors guns and the reclaiming of Tiger Hill. But for me, that reportage was again about who are these people? And I focused on that. And it was very similar in COVID, that who are these people? Who are these health workers? Who is this man who went to bury his best friend at a burial ground in Chennai and gets hit with bricks and stones and has his car and ambulance thrashed? And, who are these two best friends, Hindu and Muslim women, doctors who get stoned when they go and try and talk about the pandemic? Who are these people? Talk about the people. And so it was similar in that way. It was similar in the way that it was a logistical nightmare to report. In one, there was no live broadcasting. We still filmed on tape. I would walk kilometers to beg chopper pilots who were carrying coffins back to also carry my tapes. There were no phones. There were no broadcast vans. In another, there was a curfew. There was no place to stay. There was no food. We were completely dependent on the kindness of strangers, at least in the beginning. Obviously, the second wave was different. And logistics, because, by the time I reported COVID, I was not just like, it was the birth of Mojo, my digital platform. We were a small team. We were 4 people in a Maruti car. But we were also reporting from the remotest places with no phone signals, no mechanisms to send footage back. So that was a similarity. And that both were extremely dangerous assignments. 3 similarities. Here's where it becomes different. The war had a finite end. It may not have been in sight when I was at the war front, but it was not a long war. It was not like Yemen that, went on for years.
It's not endless crisis and conflict.
It was a war that ended. COVID showed no signs of ending. Like even 2 years into it, it showed no signs of ending. It was the longest crisis, possibly life-threatening crisis that I have ever reported on. And more than me, I remember the words of this nurse whom I met at Kama Hospital in Mumbai, whom I write about. And she said to me, she was there when 26/11 happened. And she was in the neonatal center, and her job was to save new mothers and newborn babies from Ajmal Kasab as he stormed their hospital. And she said to me that was really a frightening night, but this is tougher. And I said, really? You are actually saying that this is tougher than 26/11? You had a terrorist with an AK-47 in your ward where you had newborn babies. And she said, it's tougher because there's no end in sight. Because I met her at the peak, I think, of the second wave, and she said, there's no end in sight. So just the length, the absence of a definable adversary, the invisible enemy, as I think Trump called it, but correctly so, and constantly shifting knowledge. When I started my journey in 2020, we were told to not wear masks. We were actually told that the masks are in short supply and we don't think it helps much. So leave the masks for the healthcare workers. And that made perfect sense to us. So we wore these plastic blue gloves wherever we went, which had no sense, we now know. But I'm saying that's how much the science changed. The science constantly changed. It changed on remdesivir, it changed on ivermectin, it changed on hydroxychloroquine, it changed on, steroids. The science kept changing. So those were the similarities and the differences.
Yeah, and also, in one area you see India, the Indian state almost at its highest level of prowess in terms of all the national resources and, you got to win this war. And logistically, I think the armed forces are the best part of the Indian state, right?
Yes.
They really have their act together. And here is the other extreme where the Indian state, like you said, is either missing or it is brutal and it's simply not functioning the way it is supposed to function in most places. And that to me was a very interesting thing. I recently read your Kargil book again to prep for the interview. And I thought, every time you talk about the army, and you're critical, but you're also pointing out all the things that the army is very good at doing, the everyday,
I have to
that.
confess that I'm a sentimentalist about the military because I cut my teeth as a reporter covering it. But I have also seen at close quarters so many things that can be learned from it that are valid for non-military people. I always say pluralism, this corroded phrase secularism. I prefer pluralism. There is nobody who exemplifies it more than the military with its Sarvdhal Dharmsthals, multi-religious sort of places of worship. The fact that the commanding officer, whether Hindu or Muslim, will perform either the arti or the namaz if that is the religion or the festival of his troops and so on. There's so many things to emulate. But also that they are able to de-escalate social situations, that they are called to lead flag marches at times of communal conflagrations. But more than that their efficiency in
mobilizing.
Right? And that is why one of the things I kept calling for, and I was judged quite sternly by some people for it. I thought that the military, let's go back to the migrant workers for a moment. After the initial let them leave, look the other way, there was this attempt to stop them. And of course, the attempt to stop them didn't work. So then there was this slightly panicked attempt to, okay, let's see what happens if we allow them to leave. But there was no planning for that. So instead of having, let's say, barricades or, crowd control and allow only 500 people at a time in single file, maybe use the military to do it. It was a free-for-all. And of course, there was a almost stampede at the bus stops and the railway stations. And then they were stopped again from leaving. And I, at that time, said that the military should be called. And the second time I thought that the military should be called was in managing oxygen movement. In neither case, I don't know why it was not done, but I thought that the military would have been very, very good, especially at being able to resolve cross-state disputes. The movement of oxygen tanks was getting impacted in intrastate battles and so on. And the military, I think, has a lot of efficiencies to borrow from. But I also wanted to make a point about when the Indian state works, it works really well. One of the things that I know that we're very good at compared to the rest of the world is our mass immunization programs.
Absolutely.
And we have seen this now with the pace of our vaccine programs. We have seen this now with how our healthcare workers, our ASHA workers, our community health workers, our local bureaucrats are able to reach the remotest places, crossing rivers, climbing mountains to vaccinate people. We've had a lot of experience with mass immunization. Our vaccination program faltered, not because we don't know how to make it run, but because we simply didn't purchase enough vaccines. We started too late. But when it started, we knew how to do it.
Yeah, we knew how to do it. Very smooth.
So there are certain things where with all our flaws, we have state capacity.
So, Land Pritchett calls India the flailing state, right? Famously, where, the head doesn't know what the limbs are doing. So in a sense, you have certain functions, like we do elections really well. We do immunization really well, right? So there's certain things we know how to do very well. But the everyday picking up garbage, making sure there's a sewer line, making sure there's water and pipe water, those things we don't do well. There's one more thing to touch upon one of your previous responses. You said the science kept changing. So one is, of course, the science is changing and the world is learning. The other is there is massive amounts of misinformation. Now, as a researcher, I know how to cope with it because I'm doing very little in real time. At best, it's a column which is written, on a, couple of days deadline or something like that. But you are one person who's doing this in real time and anyone can go back. It's not like it gets erased, right? We could just go back and watch the videos you did last week where you told us something completely different if that is the case. How do you know what is misinformation, what is correct information, and what is changing information? Because that's the nature of what's happening in real time.
And also deliberate fake news. Let's also factor that in because we actually had TV channels at the height of the first wave using hashtags like Corona Jihad, vilifying, an entire community. Look, the Tablighi Jamaat congregation was wrong. And I said it then and I'll say it again. But it was as wrong as any mass congregation at the time.
We had the Kumbh congregation just before the Delta wave, right? I mean, this can be any religious or non-religious.
And I'm saying it's wrong irrespective of which religion it is. But, there was some active fake news around that, right? Absolutely. There was some active fake news, including sort of suggestions that Muslim patients were spitting on doctors and so on. These hashtags were actively hate-mongering. So in this information age, WhatsApp forwards, one is hate and deliberate fake news. But the more complicated thing for people like us is you want to be on top of what you're reporting. You don't want to be very slow and the last, but you don't want to say anything that's inaccurate. I actually think that it's okay, and I always tell young journalists this, it's okay to say, I don't know. Your audience will understand that. Just when you don't know, please say you don't know, right? So let's take remdesivir. I literally do not understand till this date, because I've seen the Americans now go back on this. Just when Indians had started accepting that it was a completely useless pursuit, we're now seeing new studies out of the US suggesting that if brought in early enough, remdesivir can help. I saw doctors from public health hospitals and private hospitals queue up for hours instead of treating patients trying to get remdesivir. I saw poor people sell whatever little gold or land they own to try and get a remdesivir injection. But do I know? I don't know. I mean, I can only tell you that Lancet said this study said this, the WHO said this, and then say, I don't know. Do I know whether it's like today? I know that it's not spread by surface, but I didn't know at some point. So I have to say, I don't know. What you can't give into is rumors. You can't give into, okay, the other thing you have to be really careful about, especially in a digital medium, is unverified videos.
Yeah.
There are viral videos and there's a lot of pressure on us as a digital platform. Oh, this has gone viral. Should we not take it? And I'm not conservative at all in any way, but I'm conservative in my journalism. I'm actually okay to not have that viral video than to have it and say, oh, this was from some completely unrelated event. We saw so much of this happening, right? So you have to be able to be late. You have to be able to say, I don't know. And you have to be able to say you made a mistake if you made a mistake. You can't just pretend that you didn't and remove it hastily, and you have to acknowledge. I don't remember offhand, but I do remember maybe once I had to say, I'm deleting this because I made a mistake and I'm sorry for that. I don't remember what the story was, but you have to be able to say it.
But you have a different kind of responsibility, right? If you break a story and you follow a story, that's the story. No one is willfully, other than very few people, peddling misinformation or fake news. But inadvertently, do you feel the big response? Do you worry about this at night? Or is this just part of your everyday life and you got to do what you have to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I was younger, it used to suffocate me slightly that I was always the story. And I know that there are people who sort of accuse me of making myself the story. And I have to ignore noise from a lot of sides, from the left and the right, to be who I am. And I've got a lot better at being that person. I think when I was younger, I was more hassled about what people were saying to me. And I actually thought that people were interested in a genuine argument and I would actually engage and explain. And now I don't do it. I don't at all explain myself. Obviously, in an interview, if I'm asked a question, I answer it. But, I'll tell you, like the biggest realization to me that I would be made the story irrespective came to me in 26/11, when certainly all of television made a mistake, because we had no idea that the handlers of this attack on India were based out of Pakistan, were monitoring this in real time. And all channels, like hundreds of journalists, were reporting this in real time because there was zero communication with the government. We had no idea what was happening. And on the third day, many of us created our own deferred signal. We just decided, okay, we'll go 20 minutes late on the live signal. And after it was all over, we were told that Pakistanis were monitoring this in real time, and the self-regulation mechanism body for television was born out of 2008, those attacks. But I was held literally singularly responsible for that, and I couldn't understand it. I was like, there were literally 150 other people there, and I am answering in interview after interview what the media did wrong. And then I just realized that it doesn't matter for reasons that I do not fully understand. There's always going to be an inordinate focus on me, my work, and me personally. It's just, I don't know why it is. Sometimes I think it's because I'm female. Sometimes I think it's because I don't conform to somebody's ideological assumption about me. The right has a lot of problems with me, but there is enough people on the left who dislike me. I'm extremely stubbornly libertarian, extremely stubbornly my own person. I do not, for the left, my sentimentalism about the military is a problem. The fact that I identify as an Indian is a problem. There's some voices on the left who do not believe in the nation state, but I do. I don't identify myself as a global citizen. I'm ferociously proud Indian. The right, dislikes me for all the reasons that we know. But I really believe that most of my country resides in neither of these spaces, is guided by common sense, is guided by a certain degree of sentimentalism. And that is always where I have sought my audience. In that place which is able to make up its mind on an issue by issue basis, is not consumed by dogma. And I think that people don't understand this about Indians, that we are not essentially dogmatic. We're not.
Yeah, and we're also not one thing.
We're not one thing. We're just like our country is many things. We as individuals are many things.
Yeah. And sometimes it is the female identity which is going to be the dominant one.
Yes.
Sometimes it's the linguistic,
Yes.
I'm a Tamilian identity. Sometimes it's our occupational identity which is dominant. And we also saw this through COVID, right? Over and over. I think, for me, the shock of it is anytime you and I engage on Twitter.
You get trolled?
No, I mean, I don't care about that. But the notifications explode, right? And then there will be the 40 of them which are, it'll hide the view because it'll say this is abusive content or whatever. And then you click on it, 40 more. And I'm like, oh, good God, Barkha wakes up every morning and this is what is Shah. So I think, I can't even imagine what that is like. But on the other extreme, I think it's also a bizarre thing. It's almost too much of a good thing is terrible for you. You're held to a higher standard. Right? Yeah. If 150 other journalists do the same thing, we don't expect more of them. But Barkha should have known that this should not be done in real time, right?
I find that people have a kind of proprietorial relationship with me. It's a strange, if that's the word, whether I do something good or I do something less than good.
Yeah.
There's that sense of everybody takes it very personally. I made an argument about period leave and I had a legion of millennial younger women just hating me for that week, and then I didn't budge and then they hated me some more. So it's my life and I'm used to it now. And I just want to make the point that, I want to share a little story. I went to the Jaipur Lit Fest and I was signing my books, and there was this young woman who came to me and she just came to get her book signed, and then she said, "Can I hug you?" And I said, "Of course." And I hugged her, and she and I were both in tears, and we have no idea why we were in tears. And I was like, I put that photograph out and I said, we spent so much time talking about trolls, and of course all of these big tech platforms owe us an explanation for how they enable hate online. All of these things are true. But we don't talk enough about the kindness of strangers. We don't talk enough about the intimacy of strangers. We don't talk enough about the fact that I could not have done this journey if people who did not know me, people sent me food, people sent me shoes, people offered to give me their car when my car broke down. The right-wing trolls who troll me day in and day out, one of them messaged me saying, I know I'm your troll, but do you need a car? There were people who, this woman who's now a friend of mine in Mumbai, she was like, "Do you have clean clothes?" I said, "No." She said, "Can I run a laundry for you?" And people weren't allowed to meet each other, so I would leave it at the gate of a house and she would run my laundry for me. People fed me. And even with trolls, we look at the comments below, but we don't see how many likes there are or how many retweets there are or how many people. I've learned this over time, and I've learned this because I've had many years of training doing this. I am able to focus actually now, for the most part, on the good and filter out the toxic. I engage with criticism where I respect that criticism. Otherwise, I do not engage with it. Because you know what? In the public space, everybody's going to have a view on you. Somebody's not going to like a photograph you shared. Somebody's not going to like the tone of your voice. Somebody's not going to like a question you asked. All that you can do is to do the best you can and then leave it. One of the things that Twitter, etc. have done to us is this chasing of likes, is this fear of being disliked. We are not in a popularity pageant. We are not. Yes, your audience needs to connect with you, but you are not. Sometimes you will make your audience uncomfortable and they will hate you in the moment for it, but they will respect you eventually. This is what I believe.
Yeah. Speaking of this popularity context, I want to talk to you a little bit about TV and cable news. Mm-hmm. Your career has basically, been that TV cable news career, and then now you've moved on to digital. And it's also paralleled India's liberalization journey, right? So you started with Doordarshan when Doordarshan was just modernizing and bringing in these kinds of young voices. And then, of course, you've had a very long, exceptional career with NDTV. And just like Indian liberalization and Indian economy, TV news was sort of at its peak, and then it's seen a decline and really a fall from grace, where now it's completely captured as a, political popularity contest and also captured by special interests, to be honest. What explains this rise and fall of TV cable news institutionally? Like, what is going on that they're all so uniformly terrible?
So we cannot understand the decline of TV news without understanding the revenue model of television. The fact is that in India, television is mostly owned by big business houses. The fact also is that your economy is not liberalized enough to not need government, any government, when business houses need clearances and permissions and so on. So business houses have a certain risk-averse attitude to power, and business houses own media. This is not untrue for other places in the world either. I write for the Washington Post, where the owner is Jeff Bezos. But Bezos would not be able to ever tell the Post what it can publish or not publish. And that goes back to a kind of cultural historicity around free speech. We have not managed to deepen some of these traditions. So we cannot understand television without locating it in the context of why our free speech commitment, even though it's constitutional and fundamental, remains something that has not deepened over the years. On the contrary, it has weakened. Secondly, the revenue model is broken. Television costs too much to run. It is behemoth, large, elephant-size operations with being completely dependent on advertisement and big capital investment. Because of this, it has stopped spending money on reporting. There have been mass layoffs in many of these organizations, and it has not adapted itself enough to technology. And the nature of the market has changed. I don't know anybody anymore, other than above a certain age group, that does, for example, appointment viewing anymore. People just watch when they can. Mostly they watch on their phones and on their laptops. Now, if you're being consumed on your phone and your laptop, why would you invest in, let's say, satellite vans? Why would you? Like, I don't know, but it costs, so much money to run it. So revenue is broken. There's a fragmentation of the market, and revenue, when I say revenue is broken, there's no way to earn except by having, and then the editorial policy is being directed by the big business that owns it. Some of this also has to do with our audiences. Some parts of our audience have accepted news as entertainment. Upending Noam Chomsky's manufactured consent, which is the phrase he used for mass media, to manufactured dissent, which is what mass media does in India, where you have sort of this dialectics of artificial confrontation where you'll position two extreme views against the other and make a tamasha out of it. And that tamasha is, TV is the new radio, somebody's eating dinner, is running in the background, you're seeing somebody shout at each other, you've got these big giant size captions because you need, it's shrinking attention spans. So it's just become a stale medium. And that is why you see so many people in the last 10 years who have left television and have tried to create a new grammar for themselves in digital. But of course, in digital, to save us, if TV was about the tyranny of first the state, because it was state controlled, then the tyranny of the market, the digital medium suffers from the fear that we will be governed by the tyranny of the algorithm. And to save us from that, I always say to audiences that crib nonstop about media, that if you are willing to spend the price of 2 Starbucks coffees per month to support the journalism you believe in, you will be keeping the journalism you believe in alive.
Your point is very well taken. And all these big business houses have millions of investments, licenses pending. Yeah. So they do need to have this complicated relationship with the state, right? Otherwise, everything else that they do tanks, which is also not ideal, right? Yeah. But is the problem a question of barriers to entry? Is it that we have, very, very high licensing fees? In fact, the licensing fees for news channels is higher than for other channels. Is it the lack of a subscriber model, that large enough group of
people?
There's
too much control. And now see that control is coming into the digital space. The government has understood that the new medium will be digital. Yeah. And therefore you have all of these new content guidelines that will make it very difficult for independent players to survive. And therefore you will be back to the same business houses that back TV, backing digital. And you'll be back to the same sort of compromised content unless a subscriber model is able to take off. And therefore, I'm not absolving journalists of our responsibility, but I do also believe that like we choose our politicians, we also choose our media.
You are also an entrepreneur now,
Yes.
right? You run your own business. Mojo is fantastic, but it is a startup company, even though it's become very, very prominent during COVID. What are the difficulties of running a business in India from a business perspective, whether media or non-media, and especially a digital media company?
So for me, the biggest difficulty is that I would like to create Mojo to be something other than my channel. I would like it, and my platform, I would like there to be more personalities. I would like there to be diverse personalities. Everybody doesn't have to be like me or think like me. I would like it to be a kind of big tent space, because I am not anti-dogma. So I would, yes, I may draw the line at certain things that I find hate speech or bigotry, but within under that threshold, I would like to encourage diverse opinions. So one challenge is, this is not, how does this become about other journalists and other kinds of programming? That's the first challenge. The second challenge from an entrepreneurial point of view is I do not want to go the VC route. I feel like I will be trapped in the same thing that try to escape in television. People will have views on risk and risk appetite and profit and all the rest of it. And I believe that I seek my future in subscription and sponsorship. And I think that those are the most honest ways to produce content. But of course, sometimes people want to be very careful even about what they sponsor. And I think the challenge for me is to build a model. And I think this model is true in large parts of the world now, where things that interest me non-journalistically are going to have to pay for things that I love journalistically. Because I don't think subscription by itself will pay for the journalism that we want to do. And so there are going to have to be other spaces, whether it's production or masterclasses or events. Yeah. Events was a big revenue model.
Some cross-subsidization model, right? Otherwise, it doesn't work.
And I remember talking to, somebody in Omidyar who told me about this Oscar-winning movie, Spotlight.
Yeah.
It was produced by a company where the films subsidize the journalism, and they do cinema and entertainment to subsidize journalism. And so this is not a completely crazy idea that I have. I think that there are lots of things that interest me. I'm completely sort of a popular culture person. I like public speaking. I like organizing and curating ground events. Hopefully in the post-pandemic era, we can go back to that. So there will have to be a cross-subsidized model. I don't think anywhere new space for itself.
What is your writing process, and both for your columns versus the book versus other things that you write, right? You give talks and you speak at events and things like that.
I don't ever prepare for a talk or an event. I have never written a piece of word on a paper. I remember once interviewing Oprah Winfrey at the Jaipur Literature Festival, and I did this introduction to her, and she said, "Where's the teleprompter?" And I said, "I've never used a teleprompter in my life." And she said, "You're lying," and like indulgently. And I said, "No, I just freeze if I have to read a prepared text. I don't know how to do it." And then in the course of the interview, she asked me again, "Where are your notes?" And I said, "I don't use notes because I find that otherwise I'm constantly looking down instead of at the person." And like, that was the best compliment I received, because she was like, "I can't believe it. I can't believe you're interviewing me without notes and a teleprompter." But so to answer your question, I don't go in with notes. I don't go in with a pre-prepared script ever at talks or for interviews. Columns are more immediate, and therefore they're easier because they're usually about something newsy, something that's happened, and mostly about something I've reported myself. So it's fresh in my head. I find I've done 2 books. I find the process of writing a book extremely difficult. I'm an anxious writer. I know that visual language is my first language, and therefore, I always worry that I don't write well enough. This book was very painful for me to write because I think I hadn't grieved for my father. I think I was haunted by guilt. I think I hadn't grieved for everybody else's loss. It felt like I was part of this community of mourners, but none of us had mourned. And twice I called Chiki and I said, "I can't do the book." I missed a deadline. I was a month late with submitting the manuscript. I went away to London on a fellowship to Oxford to see if I could do it better there, and I couldn't. And I would just cry for no reason while writing the book with no immediate provocation. These days I find myself crying while discussing something. I was discussing tuberculosis with somebody the other day, and mid-sentence I burst into tears. So there's obviously a lot going on with me, and the book, I believe, is, while the process of writing it was very difficult, writing a book needs a lot more work. There's a lot of reading I do. There's a lot of cross-checking of facts that has to happen. There's a lot of rewriting I do, and I'm not a rewriter. I'm a very spontaneous person. There are almost no take-twos in anything I do for video. But in the writing of this book, I rewrote, I needed to recreate something, I needed to bring it alive visually. It's very difficult for me because I'm used to the visual just speaking for itself. I'm a broadcast person. But now I have to adapt that language and describe it. And so there's a lot of rewriting. I feel that I'm a slow writer. So the book is different in the way that I write it.
Is there a process?
There's no process. I carry my laptop around. I get impatient with where I'm sitting. I sometimes find a sofa to lie on. Sometimes I sit at a writing desk. Sometimes I take it into a cafe. Mostly I don't know if this happens to other writers, but it's traumatic for me to write. I struggle.
It happens, I think, to other writers. It's very comforting to know that this is the case. I struggle. But the book is very well written and it's very vivid. The thing about the book, I think that I was a little nervous about while reading it, but also which got me through to the other side is how visually descriptive it is, right?
Well, I'm glad to hear that because that was the real challenge.
It's almost like, each time when you describe someone, I feel like I know them. And sometimes I do know them because I've seen them in one of the Mojo clips in the past. And I'm like, okay, wow. I've been asking through the podcast, we finished 50 plus episodes and all of it in the pandemic. So my usual question is, what have you been binge watching during the pandemic? But I know I've been stalking you during the pandemic. So I know you're not binge watching anything. But I do want to ask you, since you're a foodie and you post so many food things, what were some of the memorable meals during the pandemic as you were all over the
the thing about food, and I know it sounds like a little bit elite to talk about food when we were reporting on people that didn't have food, but that's a dysfunctionality about our privilege that we have to accept. And food was a source of joy and solace for me at a very bleak time, especially because in the first wave there was so little of it available.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the best meals I had was in Kolhapur, when the dhabas were closed on the national highways, right? I have no idea why we did that because God knows. Anyway, we learned from that. We didn't do it in the second wave. The dhabas weren't officially allowed to be open, and we would go into these places and we would beg them, kuch khana de do. So they say, you can't be sitting here, the cops will come and get us. So we would go and hide at the back of a dhaba in some little khet. And this one man, he cooked us some kolhapuri dal and some naan, and it was just the best food. So I remember that. I remember being in Dharwad and having golgappas at some little ready. And I was like, oh my God. And then poha. And I don't know. And I would take photographs of all of it because it was such a source of joy for me, and it's not just because I was a foodie, but because there was something reaffirming. There was something reaffirming about the rhythm of life that you could still taste. And I remember after I had COVID and I got COVID, the day I cremated my father, I tested positive. And for 14 days, I could taste nothing. And I would just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. It was just a desperation to taste again. And there's something about that food that was about the reaffirmation of life. And, in this book, I just want to finally say that little things gave me pleasure, right? I would buy a box of nutties at a store that was open and I would take it with me. Little patta of chaat, a little plate of chola bhatura, the food that people would pack in tiffins and send us from their homes, that you haven't had home cooked food. And to me, it represented that intrinsic. One of the things is that it's been a bleak time, but it's also been a time when I've seen and met some really kind and generous people, and even extremely poor people. When they could feed you, they fed you. They fed you. And if you would offer them money, they'd be offended. With so much love and generosity. And I just want to say that Humans of COVID, as much as it is about our collective loss, it is also about our collective spirit. It is also about our collective resilience, our collective hope, and the fact that we are intertwined and we are interconnected. And this is not my story. This is our story.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for doing this. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalan. For the next episode of Ideas of India, I speak with Naushad Forbes about his new book, The Struggle and the Promise: Restoring India's Potential.